Greetings, Western Civ. Welcome to week 6. Sorry for the delay in getting this out to you. There's a lot going on this week, so let me just give you a kind of an overview. Now, last week we talked about revolutions of the 18th century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian, and the German Coast Uprising. And then we talked about the Industrial Revolution. And all of this plays together in a very intricate narrative that leads us to World War. And before we can talk about World War, we have to understand what was going on in Europe that led to an internal strife of that continent. And you got to go back to France post revolution. Now, what we see during the French Revolution is the uprising of the middle and lower classes, and the one and only time really in Europe where government is taken over by these groups. Now, when this happens in France, there is the beheading of the king and queen, and many of their rich friends and those that weren't killed were pushed out of the country, and the middle and lower class take over these lands. And so you've got a territorial issue as well. Now, if you're in, let's say you're in England or you're in Spain and you were just witnessing the French king and queen being executed and you were in leadership, you sure want to make sure that someone is coming back in to bring back normalcy and centralized government. And that's where we see the entering of Napoleon. Napoleon, this amazing military mind, and it's able to centralize government. He creates a new code of law, the Napoleonic Code. And as we know, if a leader can come in, especially a military leader, when we have the dissolution of government and they can create a uniformity, they're going to be very appealing to the people in mass. And so Napoleon is able to strike a deal that allows for the elites to come back into the country while allowing some of the middle class to retain parts of those lands they had taken claim to. So everyone kind of wins a little bit. Napoleon's very, very popular when he first comes in. But remember, in Europe, at the time of these revolutions, we see a new understanding of the role of government to the people, and we have a new understanding of what government is. These are supposed to be independent nation states that have their own sovereignty. And so when Napoleon becomes heady and is craving more and more military conquests and begins to look outside of the French boundaries into taking over other places in Europe and even, other places of the world, and naming himself emperor. Well, once again, we're going to see the European powers taking action. And so you've got this short video on Napoleon here that gives you kind of the background on that. The Congress of Vienna is the resolutions with the fall of the Napoleonic Empire and the reconstruction of Europe into what they're hoping will be strong nation states that will diminish the chances that another power-hungry leader might come in and overtake the different countries. And of course, we know what happens in World War II, don't we? And we'll talk more about that. Now, you also have a viewing here on the scramble of Africa. Let me pull up a PowerPoint here for you and talk a little bit about what happened. So before we get to World War I, we need to think back. You've got these different countries in Europe that have been colonizing the Americas. And once the Americas, Central, South, and North America have been, basically conquered, quote unquote conquered, and there's no more like new land for these European nations to fight over because those boundaries have already been set. They're going to turn their attention to other places in the world. The Industrial Revolution leads to a new demand for resources, right? We need more materials to make our things that we can sell, and we have more demand for that. We need new places to go. And so the first place that we see Europe turn their attention to is Africa. Before the 1800s, the internal areas of Africa were thought of as the white man's graveyard because of the different types of diseases and bugs, such as the testes flies. If Europeans were to go into Africa, the majority of them would die. But now we have new technology that allows for a safe venture in, if you will. And so from about 1870 to about 1900, the entirety of Africa is colonized. You can see here that the Germans are down here at the bottom. You've got French west, and so again we see this new empire building of Europe. And so by the turn of the 20th century, the majority of the world has had some kind of European influence. And what happens after that? Well, there's no new lands that really can be conquered, and so they begin to turn on each other. And so we see this aligning of us versus them, right? One of those unfortunate natural human reactions. And so we have the centralized powers and the allied powers, and then, of course, the neutral powers. And this is what leads us to war. Because, once there is nowhere else to look outward, they begin to look inward. The Austria-Hungarian crown is assassinated, and, just sparks off this war. And it's going to be a violent and bloody affair, right? And it happens on very diverse theaters here. You have land and water and mountains, and then if you're the central powers, you're fighting all around you, and it's a bloodbath. The casualties estimated at 60 million. We haven't seen anything like this before in Western civilization, and that's because you have these new technologies. You have air bombings now that are going to be, just widespread. And so for the first time in Western civilization, we see a high number of civilian casualties, okay? And at least half were civilians. And you've got submarines, you've got bombs, you've got tanks and machine guns, just the ability to wreak havoc in a new way. Poison gases, trench warfare, and beyond all that, this is the kind of cannon we had during the Civil War, right? And now we're seeing cannons that are exponentially larger. So it just complicates the nature of war and leads to large. Propaganda is also an important new, and not so new, but a new invention in that for the first time we're seeing propaganda used en masse to cultivate nationalism. And, not only is it about creating nationalism, but also there is gender encouragement here, and we'll see that in World War II as well. But, just to give you an example from the U.S. perspective, an anti-German propaganda machine was at work here. As you can see, restrictions on education, on voting, right? Don't speak the enemy's language. So, we see a new type of nationalism that's anti-immigrant. And a lot of that comes out of the fact that in the U.S., there is a large wave of immigrants that are coming in from Europe at the turn of the 20th century. And then, of course, Germany is to blame, if you will, for World War I. Now, here we see the signing of the armistice that ends the World War I here at this French rail train station. And just to give you a hint of what happens, just a couple decades later, Hitler goes to that same spot, to that same train car where Germany had to admit defeat before. And here he forces the surrender of the French, and then he blows up that rail car so that there cannot be another image taken that challenges the German narrative, right? So Hitler definitely understood the use of propaganda and the use of imagery, and that plays out in the expansion of the Nazi philosophy and propaganda, and there's some readings on that as well. So, but going back to World War I and the end of it, there are a lot of rules of surrender, and the steps that are taken during the Treaty of Versailles here lead us to World War II because of what happens in Germany. Germany, is to blame, and so in the eyes of the Allied powers. And so what happens is when there is a surrender, Germany is penalized. And first off, Germany can't, after this, have a standing military. They have to return all the, and they have to disarm their high seas. Now the Rhine is going to be patrolled by Allied troops, and Germany is forced to pay reparations. And understand that at this period of time, we're going into the Great Depression. And although we like to think of things from the perspective of the United States, the Great Depression hit all of Europe as well. And so think about it, think about the destruction of World War I, all the buildings that are destroyed, all the people who are gone, and now the economy has just plummeted. There's very little that the Allied states are going to be able to do to ensure that Germany does not rise in power. And again, Germany itself, is in a bad way. And enter Hitler. Here is someone who's saying, I'm going to make us great again. I'm going to bring back the power of Germany pre-World War I. And so one of the things that occurs with this treaty and this defeat is this thing called the stab in the back myth. And when you watch the video on propaganda, the narrator actually mentions and references this. It's a very important concept, propaganda here. Now, basically what it says is that the German troops, they didn't actually lose, right? Germany didn't actually lose. What it was, in fact, was there was a civilian government that was put into place, and this civilian government stabbed Germany in the back. And that's why, we don't have any military, and why we're so broke, and why everything is, blamed on us. And so this kind of narrative allows for a anti-Semitic perspective, and allows for the rise of this extreme narrative of nationalism to rise. Okay, and so that's how Hitler comes to power. Now, if you go and you look in here, you're going to see causes of World War I. You can look through that. Here's the timeline, war propaganda. There's that Treaty of Versailles that I mentioned there. And what are the causes of the Second World War? And this talks at large about what happens in Germany. This World War II, a short documentary, gives you some background on that. Women at War, here is just a great resource to see the different ways in which women were engaged in these international issues. And then the path to Nazi genocide, this resource right here is a timeline on what happens in Germany that leads to the reduction of the rights of Jewish people, and then finally to the genocide of the Jewish people. It's not like Hitler comes into power and he's spouting from day one, the massive destruction of a whole group of people. It's a slow reduction of protections. Okay. At first, there are small steps, such as, and not so small, but, it's largely the stab in the back myth says, this group of people over here, they're to blame. We shouldn't allow them to teach our students. We shouldn't allow them to be in the military. We shouldn't allow them to own certain kinds of businesses. Or maybe we shouldn't allow them to have a lot of money. And then maybe we shouldn't allow them to own any property. Maybe they should have to wear an identifying marker on their shirt that tells us that they're one of those people. Maybe we should take their names away and call them all women Rachel, and all men one name. And maybe we should make them live in these ghettos. And maybe then we should take them and kill them. Right? And so there's a step-by-step, a very thought out plan that leads otherwise reasonable people to accept very horrendous actions. right? We talked a few weeks ago about what happens with the indigenous people and the rise of slavery, of African slavery. And here we're seeing another moment in history that makes us have to question humanity, but understand it step by step, right? Atrocities seem almost to go under the radar for those within cultures when it comes in these insidious manners. That is not to say that everyone embraced this. There are many stories of German people hiding their friends and their neighbors and putting their own lives at risk to protect and save others. There is still that heartbeat of humanity. Now, as we're seeing, the rise of Nazism, I have here for you another link that shows you the kind of propaganda that was used on children. Because if you want to perpetuate an idea into culture, teach it to the children, right? If you want to end a certain cultural understanding, remove it from the children. And so we see this, as part of the ways in which Nazism will rise as a national identity. This week also discussed the Japanese internment. So, in the United States, once the U.S. was pulled into World War II, and there's reasons why we weren't engaged, and it's largely dealing with industrialism and our desire to maintain our commerce globally. But we get involved, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And so all of a sudden, these Americans whose families have come generations before even from Japan find themselves being forced into these internment camps. They're not concentration camps in that there weren't, major, just intentful genocide occurring. But there is still a loss of the protections of citizenship that occur here. Imagine if you and your family were forced to go live in a internment camp, which oftentimes was just whatever was available. So there are people who had to go and live in a horse stall, right, in a barn for 5 years. If you had to go and do it, well, for 3 or 4 years. If you have to do that, you've lost your job, you've lost your money, you've lost your home, right? And so what we see is the destruction of people's lives. And then once the war's over and they're released, now there's this new anti-Japanese sentiment. It's hard to get a job, it's hard to recover. And so this is what we're talking about for the assignment this week. And again, the assignment's been extended. It's not due on Wednesday. It's due next Monday. You have additional time to reflect on this. This podcast right here, More Perfect, is a great series. They have 2 seasons of stories on Supreme Court cases. The one that you're going to listen to is the podcast on Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu was a American citizen who was of Japanese descent, and he did not want to go to the camps. He challenges this federal dictate and says that it's a challenge to his citizenship. And so the Supreme Court makes a decision on that has long-lasting impacts. And so for your assignment this week, and again, the due date is extended, you're going to consider those few sources there that talk about the deduction of citizenship and the path to genocide in Nazi Germany, as well as the internment camp and the Supreme Court decision here. And you want to look at the role of citizenship and how that role played out in Germany and the United States during World War II. You will write a formal, persuasive academic essay that answers the following questions. In what ways are individuals historically protected or not through citizenship in the United States and in Germany? And we're talking about World War II here forward. And then how secure are current citizenship protections in the United States? reflecting on your own outside research. This needs to be written in the third person voice. So I don't want to see any I or we or me or you. You want to use an objective academic voice here. We've been working on this. Your first assignment, you were able to use more of a first person narrative. And so now we're stretching our academic legs here and seeing how well that we can work towards a more formal narrative voice. As you see here, it has to have at least 3 outside resources that I have not assigned to you already. And your paper must be at least 7 pages long. That includes a cover page and a reference. So 5 pages in total. That's double spaced. Follow MLA formatting with your margins. Use your 12 font Times New Roman, and make sure that you are properly referencing, citing, and including proper formatted MLA formatted citations as well. Okay, edit through and make sure you've read and there's no spelling errors as well. So this is your final writing assignment. If you have questions about it, you can always ask me. I'm around. You can email me your rough draft before you submit it for a grade, and I can give you feedback before you submit it. So that might help you as well. And what else can I say to you? There's a lot to get through. Again, this timeline, this, and these right here, these sources really will give you an orientation for the assignment. These, again, are just suggested readings because there's just so much to get through. If you want to know more, here is more content for you. And because this week is so heavy, although a lot of it is reflective short content, still, for our last week, I've restricted the content to just one article on decolonization, one on the Cold War, and then one Vice video on the more current Cold War. And then part 3 of Guns, Germs, and Steel for anybody who's interested. Now, you will see in week 7 your journal entry and your last quiz as well. So those will be coming. I hope this is helpful. If you need me, send me an email, and we will talk soon.